On offering today, Ancillary Justice by Leckie.
Let's get out of here. Ready for light speed? 1, 2, 3!
This is her debut novel, part of a trilogy, which of course has 4 books. This work has been termed a space opera, though I have to say I'm not entirely convinced this label holds a meaningful definition to be useful. Well, let's take a look briefly at what this definition is for a second. I was highly titillated to learn that there is a definitive pedigree for this phrase. I'm quoting Wikipedia here. The term was coined by none other than Mr. Wilson Tucker in 1941 in an article in Les Zombies magazine. Now I'm intrigued. Mr. Tucker was simply extrapolating from the pejorative label horse opera. His exact phrasing was, a hacky, grinding, stinking, worn-out spaceship yarn. Thank you, Mr. Tucker Wilson. So for our strict BookBuzzters review policy, we will not be able to fully explore this entire space opera because we will only be covering the first book. This 2015 novel not only swept the Hugo and Nebula prizes, but it also, unique among our list of 25 books, is the only work to have also bagged the prestigious Arthur C. Clarke Award in the same year. But the Arthur C. Clarke Award only actually began in 1987. But it did add, for good measure, the Locus Awards in that year. So, by any standards, this is an incredibly highly acclaimed and smashing debut book. Before we launch into our full review, a brief disclosure. I did in fact read all 4 of the books well before I embarked on this BookBuzzters project. So, honestly, it's difficult to review purely based on its own merits as a single book. It's not easy to ignore the entire legacy of this series. So I had to reread it. To put it into perspective, it would be very unfair to rate, say, Dune, based on the retread crud of the 8th book in that series. So, enough of that. On to our rating system, the green lightsaber for writing and literary achievement. Ancillary Justice proved hard not to crack. On the one hand, Leckie is really a florid writer of great talent. She can truly convey a sense of scale. She has a vastly multi-pronged language toolkit to describe her characters and worlds and space stations. Yet as good a writer as she is, her language never reaches escape velocity. She never really propels me out of my chair into orbit. I was left afterwards with only fleeting and superficial impressions. Nothing stuck to the ribs. To illustrate this, let's read a passage. There was, as yet, no official temple in Urs. These are all primarily dedicated to Amat. Any other gods on the premises take lesser places, and the head priest of Ikt had not seen her way clear to demoting her god in its own temple, or identifying Ikt with Amat closely enough to add Radchai rights to her own. So for the moment, Lieutenant On's house served. Each morning, the makeshift temple flower bearers removed dead flowers from around the icon of Amat and replaced them with fresh ones, usually a local species with small, bright, pink, triple-lobed petals that grew in the dirt that collected on the outside corners of buildings or cracks in slabs, and was the nearest thing to a weed, but greatly admired by the children. And lately, small cupped blue and white lilies had been blooming in the lake, especially near the buoy barricaded prohibitive areas. What do you think? Now, in my humble view, Leckie does much better when she is sticking to the grander scale of things, not so focused on this trivial or personal fluff. She's going to rate a pretty low score. I think out of 5 green lightsaber swords, she's going to land a pretty middling 2. Now, let's move on in our next phase. We will examine the big science fiction idea our BookBuzzters blue lightsaber. As always, our question here is, what's the author's take on where we will go? Or what will we find on our voyage to this fantastic planet in time and space? Now, this book, Ancillary Justice, takes place in a sort of, let's say, galaxy far, far away. In fact, it's never really made clear whether we're even in the same universe. There's never any mention of Earth, though her Radish Imperial Empire is totally human. This book, and of course the entire series that I said I would not really talk about, it reminds me in many ways, especially the scope, of the Culture series by Ian Banks. It takes place on a massive scale, an empire that's lasted thousands of years and encompasses many worlds and planets and space stations and AI and aliens, etc., etc., etc. Though, as far as our tech goes, it's kind of like Star Trek. So it's so far advanced that you can't really even connect the dots to current science. Her main character is this former artificial intelligence consciousness that controlled a starship. But now it's reduced to a single body of what she terms a corpse soldier. The best way to describe it would be to think of a Borg, but with all the gadgets and doodads and knickknacks hidden away. And like the Borg, this protagonist was part of a larger unit, kind of a hive group, and it was coordinated to be the eyes and ears for this non-corporeal artificial intelligence. Then, after being cut off, she, though there are no genders in the Radish culture and it's very confusing, she struggles to find her identity and purpose, and she suffers a fair amount of this cognitive dissonance. It sounds a hell of a lot like 7 of 9, right? Let me mention briefly that in Leckie's sci-fi galaxy they also, of course, have faster-than-light travel. This time with the help of the ubiquitous gate. Now, this tool is used so much now by so many and in so many different forms, no one ever really even thinks to notice it anymore. I think, that's, crazy kids, what do you do? Leckie's most novel idea for the sci-fi is her supreme leader. This is a kind of post-human, meta-human. The leader is so integrated in all the technology of the regime that she can access anything, go anywhere, turning on and off all the toys in the realm with her magic encrypted keys to the kingdom. So this mad emperor then suffers from a massive schism. This is brought on by the appearance of an alien race that's so much more advanced and incomprehensible that the Empress can't find a way to deal with them, or destroy them. And consequently, she just loses her shit. She goes bonkers, cuckoo. Then she goes to war against herself because she inhabits a literal army of me. She has bodies, thousands of copies of herself strewn about this vast empire. Now, this dynamic of the paranoid, whacked-out Empress is the bedrock framework for the entire Space Horse opera. It's crazy stuff, no? So for our blue lightsaber sci-fi idea, even though much of her universe is difficult to fathom because you can't really speculate intelligibly on the plausibility of her sci-fi ideas, and Leckie makes it work. It's not a totally hacking or grinding, worn-out space yarn. Ancillary Justice merits 4 blue sci-fi lightsabers. In our next chapter, the red Sith lightsaber for Anne Leckie's storytelling chops. This book, Ancillary Justice, is much like the schizoid ruler. She is at 2 ends of the spectrum at the same time. So, on the one hand, she succeeds brilliantly in her Herculean world building on a galactic scale. All the grand elements of clashing and splashing in this Romanesque space empire. Kudos to Anne Leckie for the sheer epic proportions. Though, to be honest, this book hardly stands on its own. It's just a chapter in an obviously much larger work, and it does not have a satisfying conclusion. Simply put, it requires you to invest much further reading to get the goods. And that's kind of a big ask. In my admittedly very subjective and absolutely grossly biased view, which I already somewhat alluded to, Leckie's crucial drawback is the sheer volume of monotonous and frankly unexciting details about the citizens that populate this empire. In addition to all the palaver about flowers, there is far too much in Ancillary Justice about manners. Leckie belabors these quaint practices that are a mishmash of idol worship that looks quite similar to a melange of Hindu, Buddhist, and Taoist pantheon. Then she talks at great length about psalms, and then rituals to accompany the prayers. And then there is the non-stop emphasis of proper etiquette for tea drinking and glove wearing. And then there's the proper forms of address and the importance of jewelry and acknowledging your betters ad nauseum. So it's like Miss Manners was assimilated by the Borg, and now that's their purpose. So all this minute detail, clearly she builds a distinct and vital portrait of her universe, yet in the end Leckie fails to kind of make me care. She might as well be describing table manners in the void, or how rude it is to fart and burp at the same time in a starship. When Leckie finally arrives at the meaty aspects of resolving conflicts in the ruler's objectives and the pesky, super advanced, mysterious aliens, and then her dilemma about how to maintain this brutal expansion of empire without simply killing off all the natives that you need to exploit, then the story finally becomes really engaging. For my money, the best parts of her story revolve around the amusingly, just really out there psychotic antics of the Mad Hatter Empress. In the climatic scenes where there are multiple versions of herself battling the other angry versions, it's marvelously slapstick. It's really great fun. Boiling all this down into a reasonable score for her storytelling admittedly was quite a task, but we here at BookBuzzters value the scientific method. So, Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice receives a not made up score of 3 red lightsabers for her storytelling. This will of course bring us to the summation, the purple lightsaber for the overall review. I'd like to say 3.5 purple lightsabers seems just right, but I have to leave it up to my editor. He might just change it one way or the other. Okay. Now I'd like to add that I don't think it's a spoiler to say that her follow-up books, Ancillary Mercy, Ancillary Sword, and Provenance, these were all also very well received, but none of them garnered the acclaim given her debut novel. So on to trivia now. I have not heard any mention of a TV series about this show, about this book, but I think if she could get the crew that did Altered Carbon, that would be a great fit. Leaving you today with one bit of intel about the cover art. It's once again by the great master of starships, John Harris. So I read somewhere that he was directly commissioned to do a specific piece, one giant painting that would then be chopped into 3 panels to cover the 3 books in this series. So then you end up with this utterly generic piece. Sure, it's great looking, but I'm quite certain that Mr. Harris was not required to read any of these books. And now, of course, to my ever-growing horror, I'm finally beginning to understand how this all works. There is, in the sci-fi book cover industry, total and complete disregard for the contents of the works. You might as well be just drawing sexy robots for the package of death sticks. You know, shocking, right? So, signing off today, your host, Michael Morelli, and my editor, the literary RPG author, Peter John. We wish you happy and safe space travels.